got Scott Patchan with us today. He's the author of Second Manassas, Longstreet's Attack and the Struggle for Chin Ridge. He was kind enough to do a book talk on this title for us recently, and he's kind enough to agree to do an interview today. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Mr. Patchan is a rather big name in Northern Virginia historical communities. Among his many accomplishments, he's the former president of the Bull Run Civil War Roundtable, and he's an expert on the Civil War and Revolutionary War. He's a popular historical guide in the region, so Mr. Patchan, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the interview to be here today.
Well, we're all excited to hear more about your work, your book. I notice you've got your poster in the back there for Second Manassas. That's available in our store online right now because we're closed to the public currently. So let's dive right in here. So what made you decide to become a historian, and what drew you to history, specifically the Civil War?
Well, growing up as a child in Ohio and the Cleveland area, one of the things I was always interested in military history. That is more World War II and things. Then right after I graduated from high school, my family relocated to Virginia. And just being on these battlefields and being able to walk here. And I would credit a lot of this to the old cast iron historical markers that the state of Virginia has long had up, demarking many sites that, driving throughout the state. And then especially when I was at James Madison University with the 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign, and driving about the area and seeing all the markers where the famous Stonewall Jackson had conducted his namesake campaign that made him famous in 1862. And then I met my future wife, and she was a native of the Manassas area and had grown up and gone to Stonewall Jackson High School in Manassas. And she introduced me to the Manassas National Battlefield, several decades ago. And, been walking these fields ever since. And it was just, I've always liked the outdoors, and then combining being outdoors, walking around on these historic fields where all of these momentous events took place, all the tragedy, all the valor and heroism, played out on these fields is still to this day. I can't walk, through Manassas battlefield and the other great battlefields of the Civil War without feeling that sense of awe, reverence, and respect for the events that came before us.
So you focused a lot on the Valley campaigns you mentioned earlier, the Shenandoah campaign. So what was so important about those in the Civil War? And you mentioned there's a lot of lessons to be learned for current leaders.
And one of the things, the Valley was going to James Madison University. And actually, one time I got interested in the 1864 Shenandoah Valley campaign. I mentioned earlier, there was a much more notoriety about Stonewall Jackson's 1862 campaign. It was much more well known, and it was a Southern success, critical towards saving Richmond from capture from George McClellan in spring and early summer of 1862. But I remember one time I was in the library in stacks at James Madison University and thumbing through the books, and I found a book called George Pond about the Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1864. And there was significantly a lot less written upon that campaign, and it fascinated me because really at that point in time, back in the mid-'80s, outside of the Battle of Newmarket, there wasn't all that much out there on the 64 Valley campaign, and yet it was a larger campaign, and by the end of it, the battles were significantly bloodier and of greater consequences than any that had come before them. And so in terms of writing projects, for me, it has proven to be a target-rich environment with a lot of opportunities to jump in and do that, what I would call boots on the ground history, where you read as many of the first person accounts of the participants that you can get your hands on, understand what they said was happening to them, and when at all possible, try and get the stuff they wrote right after the battle, the letters home, the long journal entries. When you have to, sometimes you have to rely on memoirs and things. But just love doing that, and then going out and traipsing these battlefields in the Shenandoah Valley. Now at this point in time, a lot of those battlefields in the valley have been preserved and are open to interpretation through the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation. But back in the late 80s and 90s, when we first started traipsing these fields, most of these places were farms, and had to knock on the doors of farmhouses and get permission from private property owners. To me, it was kind of an added challenge, is because unlike, say, going to Gettysburg or Antietam or even Second Manassas, none of the we will say the monuments and the markers and things just weren't there, and a lot of this research really had to be figured out using surviving landmarks and topographical features such as ridges, ravines, and streams, and so forth. So the 64 valleys presented a lot of challenges, and that kind of really felt it was calling me to it, and it's been continue to this day to be very involved out there, doing a lot of tours and working. Right now I'm involved in an interpretive project for the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation, where we're working on, at the Third Battle of Winchester battlefield, we are working on revamping all the interpretive marks, coming up with a more cohesive interpretation. There's several versions of signs that have been placed out there at different iterations over the last 15 years. So we're working now to kind of put them all into a coordinated plan and trail system.
The previous author who came to speak with us, Eugene Scheel, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a map maker of Northern Virginia, and we got talking about sources, and you just said something that reminded me of something he told me, which a lot of people have an image of historical research as being in a library with books, volumes, that kind of thing, and there is that aspect. But you mentioned knocking on doors and talking to people whose private property are historical sites. Do you get a lot of your source material from private hands?
For those types of things, you don't necessarily get someone saying, "Oh, hey, here's my great-great-grandfather's diary or his letters about the battle." But what you do get, in some of these cases, you meet people who did have family connections to the family that lived in that house at the time that the battle went on, and they will share with you some of those stories. One of the other things that sometimes you'd meet is that, you'd meet people, and, it's kind of an evolutionary process where, your ring of connections associated with a particular battlefield. And a lot of times you meet a lot of relic hunters, and people would say, "Hey, talk to this gentleman. He started hunting that property back in the 1950s with World War II surplus mine detectors." And so you start meeting these people, and they really helped, like I was talking about earlier, locating where things were. And, so it's just one aspect of it, though, is that personal stuff where, people who have, when they dig those relics, when they're able to tell you, "Hey, there was a battle line, out here in this field, right here in this position. I could tell that by all the dropped bullets that we found over the years as we've relic hunted out here." And again, you get a few stories. A lot of the source material's changing. It's a lot easier now, the internet. So many resources that 30 years ago you had to get in a car and drive to upstate New York, drive to Atlanta, Georgia, drive to Columbus, Ohio, to all these state archives and things to do your studies, and get into those where the collections were at that held those soldiers and officers' letters about that. And it's just key that this closer you can get things that are written towards the time of the event you're writing about is just so important. Because as time goes on, people tend to, your memory becomes clouded with not only what you directly recall about it, but then, you talk about things with other person that you've had shared experiences with. And then your memory becomes clouded by, well, my buddy John told me this and he saw this, and, things start changing. You get into a lot of these Civil War veterans, they're writing memoirs in the 1880s and 1890s. And, like sometimes for Second Manassas and Third Winchester and a couple other, the 64 Valley battles, I can see memoirs that were written and accounts that were written in newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s. And then I realize, I say, hey, I've seen that before. And you'll see what they're doing is they're writing, and there's another article that maybe not, I'm not saying it's plagiarized, but you can definitely see they're talking about this account where they read, I'll use an example, General Jubal Early's account. And some of these memoirs, then the participant then writes themselves up into this big picture perspective of what happened, because that general wrote about an overview of a battle, and then this private who was on the firing line suddenly is talking about seeing things that are happening over such a wide expanse of the battlefield that you realize that he's writing much about what he studied and learned about the battle as what he is actually remembering from his personal experiences.
You've studied the Revolutionary War as well as the Civil War. Can you get into some of the details surrounding that conflict and how it might compare to the Civil War?
Yes. Well, first I'd just like to, talk about some of the sites that in the Revolutionary War that I've done a number of tours at. And I kind of like some of these off the beaten path sites, when you get up, I like the 1777 campaign in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley, where you had a British Army under General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, as he was known, moving down. And this resulted in the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. But it's actually a whole march. And one of the things that appeals to me to that campaign is it's just a beautiful region. You come down the Hudson River Valley through Lake George. And there were several smaller battlefields off into the mountains to the east in Vermont and eastern New York, as Hubbardton and Bennington, and you creep over into Vermont. You visit Fort Ticonderoga up at the general area where Lake George and Lake Champlain come together in that region. And being up there in those mountains, it's just a beautiful region, really away from, civilization, so to speak. So I always enjoy doing things up in that area. Another area in the Revolutionary War that I like, and that friend Gary Eckelbarger and myself have done a number of tours, is down in South Carolina in the 1780, 1781 campaigns. And that campaign got really nasty. It was it was a brother against brother. It wasn't just redcoats against the American Continental Army. It was loyalist. I mean, I say loyalist in that sense, loyal to the crown of Great Britain, fighting against the rebels, the Continentals, against each other. So we got some real cutthroat warfare there, and and a lot of these sites are still there. You get into some of the larger battles there at Kings Mountain, and then there's an epic fight on January 17th of 1781 where Daniel Morgan whipped the bloody Bannister Carleton at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina. It was a decisive win for the Americans and was one of the battles that helped change the tide of the war, because as you know, by fall of 1781, Cornwallis will surrender to George Washington at Yorktown. You know, if we get that us back to Virginia, one thing though is that in terms of Revolutionary War sites in Virginia, they're just simply dwarfed by the magnitude of because of the combats that occurred during the Civil War here in Virginia. So there's not a lot of comparison. Just first of all, the sheer volume of military activity in the Civil War and the sheer size of it kind of dwarfs the actions of the Revolutionary War in Virginia. That's not to say that there were not important events that did take place here during that point in time. Another thing that helps you is when you study the Revolutionary War and the relative small size of some of these battles here. You know, say take the Battle of Cowpens that I referred to. You know, you might have only had about 3,000, 4,000 men tops on that battlefield. When we compare that to Second Manassas, which I do a lot of work at here in Virginia, you know, you had 60,000 men in Robert E. Lee's army, probably 75,000 men total, and all the forces under General John Pope. That's 130,000 men. So you just, right there, you see the difference in the scope of the engagements between the two conflicts of the two different eras. But they both intrigue me nonetheless, and they are all certainly worthy of study. In fact, I think the American Revolution is kind of experiencing a rebirth. A lot of new books coming out on battles that hadn't been, I would say, covered as in depth as you would expect, or to the extent that a lot of battles in the Civil War have a lot of detailed histories and attention to them. Whereas in the Revolutionary War, there's a lot of wide open areas where, you know, we're just starting to get into writing some of these first class battle histories. Gentleman Harris, just a few years ago, put a book out on the Battle of Brandywine, and I understand he'll have another one coming out soon on the Battle of Germantown, hopefully by the end of this year. So a lot of good reading out there on Revolutionary War as well as Civil War these days.
You had mentioned that a lot of leaders today could take some lessons from what happened at the Second Battle of Manassas. Could you comment maybe on what those lessons might be?
Yes, yeah, I've taken several fairly large organizations, anywhere from 20 to 40, 50 people who are organizational business leaders, their industries. And, you know, I try and take Second Manassas and I frame it at the beginning from the perspective of President Abraham Lincoln. As 1862 is worn on, Abraham Lincoln is a visionary leader. He wants to change the war, not just from a war to save the Union, but he's becoming more and more convinced about, you know, ending slavery. He wants ending slavery to become one of his objectives. And he also believes that, you know, the software approach that George McClellan had taken, where we're just more trying to shoo the South back into the Union and get things back as they were, to restore the status quo. He's moving away from that. So I try and let you know, it's kind of like leaders maybe trying to make organizational change out there. So he set the stage. And so what does Lincoln do? Well, first of all, he knows that a lot of the people in the Union Army in 1862 don't necessarily share his political goals. So he reaches out to John Pope, who has achieved it's a significant, but in the terms of some of the other things, relatively minor success in a victory at the Battle of Island Number 10. He reaches out to John Pope and brings him east. And they're going to conduct a harder war. They're going to take a much more sterner approach against the South. They're not going to they're going to end the practice of guarding the homes of Confederates and returning slaves to slave owners that had heretofore been the practice. And again, he also wants to change the war objectives. You know, he has wants to do the Emancipation Proclamation, but he needs military successes before he can start making changes. But he picks John Pope to be his agent of change. And so Pope's the guy that this CEO, Abraham Lincoln, is relying on to institute change. Now, we know that, Pope was a guy that ultimately failed, and that Lincoln, ironically, after the failure of the Second Manassas campaign, returned to George McClellan, whose political views were diametrically opposed to Abraham Lincoln's and was not necessarily a proponent of the ending of slavery. He's going to capitalize upon McClellan's successful defense of Maryland and forcing Lee to retreat after the Battle of Antietam to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's just one of the ironies there of how things worked out for President Abraham Lincoln there. Now, getting back in there, and how we can take lessons from the Second Battle of Manassas, one of the things I work with managers, I talk about John Pope issued the famous joint orders to General Irvin McDowell and Fitzjohn Porter on the 29th of May. And ultimately, these orders become famous more because of Pope would utilize them to have Fitzjohn Porter court-martialed and essentially blamed for the Union defeat at Second Manassas, when if you really start looking at these orders, they really portray not a clear vision of John Pope for how he was going to conduct the Second Battle of Manassas and defeat Robert E. Lee's army on August 29th, but rather hesitancy. They contain a phrase in there, to advance and move forward to get to the rear of the enemy, but be ready to fall back, for I feel we may need to fall back this evening. But nevertheless, this order would be utilized to cashier Fitzjohn Porter from the army. So it presents a great lesson for leaders of really understanding and knowing you need to be clear in your communications with your subordinates. You need to outline clear expectations for them and make sure that your communication has elaborated that. And if you truly expect somebody to follow a precise plan of action in their work, then you need to make sure that you have outlined it as such in the instructions that you give them. I also like to point out, in the Union defeat at Second Manassas, it could have been a lot worse than what it was. But you had some frontline leaders there, and I like to tell the story of Colonel Nathaniel McClane. He had been sent over to the left in the vicinity of Chin Ridge, and he was been sent there to support a larger division of troops under about 4,000 or 5,000 men under General John Reynolds. And backstory to General McClane is that his father was a Supreme Court justice at the time of the Dred Scott decision was made in the late 1850s. The decision that essentially declared that a slave was property even if its owner temporarily moved into a free state. Now, his father dissented from that opinion and disagreed and believed that if we have classes of people to whom the guarantees of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights do not apply, then it wouldn't be long before that the guarantees that our founding documents founded us would be eroded and could not be sustained over the long term. So Associate Justice John McClane and his dissent to the Dred Scott decision kind of became a darling to the abolition community. And when the war broke out, his son Nathaniel helped raise a regiment of troops and became their colonel out of Southeast Ohio. And in 1862, he found himself at a point of decision, probably one of these things we might call a profile of courage type of a moment. Where McClane, who had been sent over there to support John Reynolds' division, and Reynolds gets ordered off to a place that he really wasn't needed. Would have been best if General McDowell had left him right there. But Reynolds is marching off, and McClane rides forward, confers with Reynolds. Reynolds warns him. And out there in the woods in front of this position are the 25,000 men of General James Longstreet's corps. And Reynolds warns McClane to take care of yourself. McClane later thought about that moment and said, you know, at that point, he said, I wasn't sure if I should follow Reynolds. I'd been assigned to support him, or, you know, but in the end, McClane realized that, you know, I'd been sent there to hold this position. And so he advances his troops to the top of the hill and begins a delaying action that ultimately allows General John Pope's army to overcome Pope's own mistakes and fight its way off of the battlefield and live to fight another day. And, you know, there's a famous quote about Second Manassas from General Phil Kearny calling it another bull run, another bull run. Well, it was certainly a defeat for the Union at Second Manassas, but because of the efforts, that first, again, by Nathaniel McClane, he was the first man that recognized that he needed to take a stand and put up a fight against Longstreet's counterattack there on Chin Ridge. And, you know, because of that, that army was able to march away, defeated, no doubt, defeated embarrassingly by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But importantly, it was an intact army, and it marched back into Washington, D.C., and was able to continue to resist, be part of the forces that continued to resist Lee when he entered Maryland. McClane's a guy that, you know, he's the type of a frontline supervisor or manager that, you know, CEOs and things, they long to have people like that, people who are willing to risk it and make decisions and take appropriate action when necessary in order to ensure the success of their businesses there. One of the things, you know, you have here organizationally with Pope's Army that makes it kind of fodder for people to look at, and especially about leadership decisions and actions and planning and communications. You know, there is so much that starts going wrong so quickly once Pope reaches the Manassas battlefield that you know, it provides a lot of fodder for discussion on decision making and communications, especially, as well as, you know, one of the other areas with John Pope himself is throughout the Second Battle of Manassas, he's constantly misinterpreting information. And one of the reasons that he's misinterpreting this information, it's not because he's getting faulty information that's coming into him, that's giving him the wrong idea about what's actually there. He's actually being warned and receiving accurate information, but it doesn't fit into the plan. He has a plan of action, how he feels he's going to crush Stonewall Jackson's wing of the army. But the data coming in is not affirming his plan. And so he's disregarding it or misinterpreting it to read it in a way that affirms the actions that he's planning on taking are exactly what he needs to do. So in short, it's Pope's leader who is disregarding contrary information from subordinates. And in some cases, he doesn't do it simply because doesn't like the person or does not trust them because they came from George McClellan's Army of the Potomac.
So in the answer you just gave, and from reading your books, your book singular, I've only read Second Manassas, it seems like you focus a lot of your energy on individual decisions made by military leaders. And as I understand it, among Civil War historians, there's somewhat of a debate about how impactful those decisions could or could not have been, specifically when it comes to the overall outcome of the war. So the controversy surrounds whether or not the South inevitably lost the war. In other words, were they doomed to fail that military campaign? Were there decisions that could have been made that would have resulted in a Southern victory? I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, I think Second Manassas campaign is a case in point that potentially Second Manassas could have been a catastrophic defeat. First of all, one of the things that if you have with maps, the Manassas battlefield, the positioning of John Pope's army on the afternoon of August 30th of 1862 was inviting a potentially devastating defeat to the Union cause. First of all, he had stripped the south side of the Warrenton Turnpike of most substantial bodies of troops and had everything focused north in what he believed was going to be a pursuit of the defeated Stonewall Jackson. And instead, Longstreet launches a driving counterattack south of the Warrenton Turnpike immediately after the attack against Jackson failed. The terrain around Bull Run, all behind John Pope's army, was steep terrain, the banks of Bull Run. And if Longstreet's able to get his army into position to command the crossing of Bull Run Bridge and cut Pope off from that, that army is going to be in dire straits. Significant portions of it are probably going to cease to exist in terms of as effective fighting forces. You're going to have large groups of men cut off, captured. Pope's going to struggle to get his artillery off, leaving most of his artillery across there. So there's a very real chance there, you know, that if you're able to take out Pope's army, what does that do to the overall war effort? Because then, you know, Lee potentially moves toward Washington, D.C. There is a force there. You know, it gets, at that point, it gets into a lot of what ifs. What are the rest of the armies going to do? What's the political impact of such a devastating defeat upon the northern populace? Do people see this, you know, as a war worth continuing? How is Lincoln viewing things at that point? So a lot to consider. But again, and then you come forward into 1864, and well, certainly, let me just say, certainly the Civil War, because of manpower and other limitations, the Confederacy's never going to go outright crush the Union and completely drive them totally out of the South. But even in 1864, where the Confederacy has lost a lot of territory out in the Tennessee, Vicksburg has fallen, Chattanooga has fallen, and Sherman is moving on Atlanta, Georgia, one of the last great industrial cities of the South. But because Robert E. Lee in Virginia throughout May, June, and the summer of 1864 is able to hold Grant at bay and prevent him from overwhelming the Army of Northern Virginia and holding off his attacks against Richmond and Petersburg, and doing that by inflicting disproportionate casualties amongst the Union forces, and throw into that a diversionary raid by Jubal Early's army to the gates of Washington in July of 1864, whereas Captain Samuel Clay, the grandson of the great senator of Kentucky, Henry Clay, wrote home to his mother and said, "We are closer to the dome of the Yankee capital than they have ever been to ours." You know, politically, the North was growing weary of the war by that point. Now, 1864 was a re-election year for President Abraham Lincoln. Now, ultimately, what happens is Sherman is successful in capturing Georgia on September 1st. 18 days later, Phil Sheridan wins the first of 3 sweeping victories over the course of 30 days on September 19th at the Third Battle of Winchester. And this creates an electoral momentum that leads to the re-election of President Abraham Lincoln. But none of those things were given. And, you know, the way the campaign had proceeded, you know, it was not out of the realm of feasibility that if the Confederacy had somehow been able to hold out a little bit longer in the Shenandoah Valley by perhaps some more conservative generalship out there by General Jubal Early, who maybe would be more cognizant of the fact that preserving his army and avoiding any major defeats was more important than holding out in the northern Shenandoah Valley, that if Sheridan was unable to achieve these victories, or if Hood was perhaps able to hold on to Atlanta a little longer, and Grant continues to lose heavy casualties in front of Petersburg and Richmond, that the Confederacy quite possibly might have won its independence electorally. And that could occur by the defeat of President Lincoln in the November election. George McClellan was running for election as the Democratic candidate on a platform that essentially said, you know, the North was tired of the war, and we're going to end the war and let the South go. So there was always the possibility of a political settlement. The other thing that the South had banked on was potential recognition from Britain and France, but they kind of overplayed the, not overplayed it, but placed too much reliance that a disruption to the supply of cotton to the European powers would lead to direct military intervention on their behalf. So short answer is no, I do not believe it was a foregone conclusion there, that the South would lose the war.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Britain and France, had the South won the war, do you think that would have been, do you think that would have triggered further European colonization in the Western Hemisphere? Would that have caused the crumbling of the Monroe Doctrine? Is that an area that you think about?
No, it's just, I've kind of had, we Civil War, those of us who are students of the Civil War, we think about those things occasionally, sometimes sit around having a glass of wine with fellow buffs and do those what if scenarios. And I've often kind of thought that, if you look at it, I wouldn't have been surprised that if the South had won the war, that you might have seen further fracturing of, let's say, perhaps what we knew as the Confederacy from the Civil War may not have stayed together as a united nation too long. Nor would perhaps, I don't think it would be a foregone conclusion that all of the northern states would have stayed together. And then you got to factor in, you've got California and the West Coast out there, and they were, are they going to stay part of the Union at that point, or are they going to start their own entity? So I would certainly have imagined there would have been further fractioning from just the two sides that fought the Civil War in the event of a Confederate victory. One can only wonder what the European powers would have done.
Sure. Well, it's, like you said, something interesting to think about.
It's one of those discussions that sometimes we would have sitting around after roundtable meetings and things, those what if things that may not fall into the realm of scholarly history, but are certainly interesting and intriguing when you're talking about them with a group of friends.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of what if scenarios, I think we have time for one more question here, but you've talked about what you're working on now. Is there something hypothetical that you'd like to work on that's hasn't yet taken shape, a historical project?
Yes, well, I'm wrapping up a biographical journal of an officer named Colonel Joseph Thoburn. Thoburn's interesting to me because in 1862 he fights at the Battle of Second Manassas, and then he ends up in all of the 1864 Shenandoah Valley campaign. So he's right into my wheelhouse, and I was able to get a copy of a portion of his journal that covers a very active period of the war in 1864. And it's kind of really interesting is that I was able to make acquaintance with his great-great-granddaughter and actually hold the sword that he carried onto the battlefield. So he was a colonel of the 1st West Virginia Infantry at the beginning of the war, and by the end of the war, he was commanding a division of 4,000 to 5,000 men when he was killed at the Battle of Cedar Creek. That was a command that was typically held by a brigadier or a major general, but he held it as a colonel. But that work will be coming out later this year. And then, I've got a book about half written on the Battle of Jonesboro and the fall of Atlanta, with Sherman and John Bell Hood in late August and early September of 1864. And it's a 2-day battle, and I've written up and completed it through the first day, and have to finish up the Battle of Jonesboro on day 2 and the subsequent fall of Atlanta. And I hope to wrap up the writing of that book by the end of this year and get that into a publisher somewhere. And then, I have worked, so when wrap up, after that, it kind of gets more into some speculative things, but I definitely at some point want to write a book on August 29th and the attacks against Stonewall Jackson beyond the railroad cut at the Second Battle of Manassas. I want to do something on the Revolutionary War. So probably, be working on writing some of those and researching on others here. So I had a lot of ideas, but right now I'm focusing on those 2 projects that I've got underway to get them done before I put too much effort in there. It's actually the August 29th book that I'd like to do on Second Manassas is something that research-wise I've gotten very heavy into that, and going back to shortly after the time that I finished writing the book on Longstreet's attack and the struggle for Chin Ridge. It's just something that's just the timing and the publishing opportunities that were presented for me. It just haven't been right for that one yet, but I'm sure it will happen. Kind of the same way with the Battle of Cedar Creek out in the Shenandoah Valley. It's just a matter of timing and the right time, and get into the right place in life where you've got the time you need to dedicate to those major studies.
Well, it would be great to host some of those at our museum for future book talks. One day we'll open up, but I, for one, will be waiting for them. So, well, I thank you for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And thank anybody out there checking in, tuning into this later on. Glad. Hope you can add some enjoyment to your downtime with COVID here, but be out there walking on battlefields and visiting museum before too much more time passes.